So hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning. I don't know wherever you are. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Nick Jacobson today to our session of the seminar Elena Avelar. Nick Jacobson is a historian of science, and his research interests are large. It's history of astronomy and cartography, but also application of new tools of practical mathematics to a number of arts and sciences across multiple cultures, mainly in the late medieval period. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a thesis with an interesting title. By the way, I will read it out because it's really beautiful. The Ends and the Means, Trans-Mediterranean Networks of Calculation and the Rise of Practical Moral Sciences in Latin Europe, 1100 to 1300. Then I first get to know Nick in Paris, because since 2019, he has worked in collaboration with the researchers of the Alpha project in Paris to study Alfonsine astronomy. And then this postdoc ended, and now he is instructor in the History of Science program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So welcome, Nick, and the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Samuel, for that introduction, and thank you both to you, Samuel, and to Luis and everyone else who's a part of making this seminar happen. I'm honored to be a part of it and to be invited to give a presentation here. What I'll be sharing with you today is largely based on ongoing research for a monograph that I'm preparing in collaboration with the ERC-funded Alpha Research Project, studying the history of Alphonsine astronomy. And I'll be focusing my attention mainly on an Italian set of instructions, which are called canons, on using astronomical tables composed in the 1470s. So my monograph is on a number of mainly Italian instructions or canons, but today I'll touch on a few of them, but I'll be specifically looking and honing in on one such set that was composed in the 1470s. I'm also going to be trying out a couple arguments with you all, so I'm looking forward to hearing some thoughts and feedback. But I believe that the organization and selection of different, what I'm going to call calculation programs that one finds in these Italian sets, that I find to be more specialized than some of the earlier forms, indicate a certain professional interest in applying the astronomical tables and the canons to specific professions, specifically ones that required a mastery of astrological techniques in either medical astrology or judicial astrology. And we'll see that specifically in this one, but I think you can sort of generalize it to a few of the canon sets that I'm going to be looking at. And I'm calling them computational programs or calculation programs because these are not just the general instructions of the canons that you would find normally in a canon set, but you actually see in the margins or the base of the page, you'll actually see a set of calculations that have been put to the side for the user to try themselves and to work out. And you see sometimes that these calculational programs are taken from the margins of the general canons and then applied to specifically astrological ones later on in the text. So I want to share an example of this kind with you all. So there'll be a little moment in after I introduce the subject where we'll all kind of look at one of these examples of this kind of calculational program as it's presented in the text. And I'm going to offer some reflections on the relationship between the professional interests that the author of this text seem to have in astrology, mathematical practice, and the way that they may, and this is speculative, but I'm going to present some arguments why I think this, the way that maybe these practical interests may have reflexively had some people think back on the theoretical interests that they might have in astronomy, or the theoretical implications that some of these practices may have had on astronomy. So in this way, the selection of specific tables and specific canon chapters may have been very important for the authors in considering who their audience was going to be and what kind of uses they wanted those tables to have. So a sort of re-emphasis on use knowledge as opposed to compositional knowledge, or a shift from thinking about making tables to using tables, and what kind of knowledge one would have to master in order to use tables. And so we'll see that questions of stability of table sets, which is sort of an important historiographic question within the history of Alphonsine tables, is going to play into this discussion as well, and questions about table set coherency. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a couple of seconds, but first, a little introduction into the history of Alphonsine astronomy for anyone who might not be as familiar with this chapter in the history of medieval astronomy. I'm not sure who's coming from where, so just a little thumbnail sketch of that. Alphonsine astronomy receives its name from King Alfonso X of Castile, who, with the help of Jewish and Muslim intermediaries, among others, patronized the composition of new astronomical tables at his court in Toledo. And the radices are set in the tables that are extant to the year 1252, but the tables may have been produced later than that, sometime in the 13th century. And the original tables, which were likely written, at least the headings of the tables were likely written in vernacular Spanish, may have undergone 2 iterations of composition. This is something that Julio Samso and others are looking at right now. So there may have been different forms of this table already in circulation in Spain. But eventually they make their way to Paris. And in the 1320s, we have the first extant versions of the tables that then become central to the teaching of astronomy in the curriculum at the University of Paris. And then from there, they would go to circulate throughout many of the universities in Western Europe over the course of the next 2 centuries. They would take on myriad forms in different institutional contexts, whether in the university context, the court context, an ecclesiastical context, and they also emerge in different social and political environments over this period of time. And so in my project in particular, I've limited myself to looking at a specific region and a specific period, which is the 15th century in Italy. And here, let's see if I can flip here. Here are the main canon texts that I've been studying over the course of the past few years on this, and the manuscripts that I have gleaned these witnesses to these canons from, and the authors that they're associated with. Of the 4 authors of the astronomical canons I study, we find that many of them have associations, clear associations with medical faculties in different universities. And this is assuming the identities of the authors of the canons as received in the literature. And I say that because the 4th of these 4 canon writers, Laurentius de Laurentiis, or in Italian, Lorenzo de Lorenzi, has been associated with a specific figure, a humanist in the second half of the 15th century. And it's still unclear to me whether or not we should associate these canons with him. Nevertheless, whoever the author of the canons were seems to have come out of a similar context, seems to have had training in and interest in medical astrology, just as Lorenzo de Lorenzi did. So both Prosdocimo de Beldemondi and Laurentius de Laurentiis trained as first in medical faculties. In the case of Prosdocimo, he trained at the University of Padua. And in the case of Laurentius de Laurentiis, he trained at Pisa, and then would later teach also at the University of Florence. They both got their degrees in medicine, as well as developing this mastery in mathematical Alphonsine astronomy. So if Laurentius is to be identified with Lorenzo de Lorenzi, then he was associated with this medical context, but he was also associated with the humanistic scholarly circles that were attached to the Medici court in Florence. And he had pupils in mathematics both inside and outside of the university. And he was a personal tutor to a specific family, the Verini family, we know, who were a family of poets. So we see this kind of interplay between university education and courtly experience on the part of many of these authors of Italian canons. This also goes for a third of these authors, Johannes de Sancto Arcangelo, who we know was served at the court of the King of Navarre in the early 15th century, as well as having contacts, and it seems to be the case that he also was educated in one of the universities in northern Italy. So you see this crossover of linguistic traditions, political traditions, as well as a crossover of institutional contexts. In all cases, attention, I would like to pay attention to the connections between astronomical practice on the one hand and the interests that courtly and medical astrologers would have. Interest in the physical and mental health of individuals, sometimes in interests in broader social and political issues of the day. And we see this in the most pronounced way. We see this in Lorenzo de Lorenzi's canons, because he is very explicit in his desire to apply the calculations found for the canons of Alfonsine astronomy to those kind of questions. This connection took the form of calculated products, objects of production that are associated with medical and judicial astrology, most notably the so-called figura in Latin, the nativity horoscope. And for those who were professors at Italian universities like Prosdocimo and Lorenzo were, there were institutional requirements that professors of astronomy or astrologia would prepare annual judgments, or the so-called judicia anni, that required the calculation of planetary positions at multiple significant times. In the case of Lorenzo de Lorenzi, he mentions not just one, but as many as 4 of these figura had to be prepared. These would be prepared for the time of the entrance of the sun into the first degree of Aries, and then another one for the most recent syzygy, one for if it was different than the most recent syzygy, one for the most recent eclipse. And if there was a great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, a figura had to be prepared for that if such an event happened within the year. So you'd have to have at least 4 of these figura prepared every year. Also, yearly almanacs would be needed, and so a knowledge of preparing such almanacs is presented in the canons, and techniques of directing significant planets in a figure, known as planetary directions, are required and discussed in this particular set of canons. So all of these requirements meant that the canon text had to be tailored to ensure that all calculating programs could be available to a student using the table if they were going to be used for these purposes. And the tables themselves were oftentimes altered. That is to say, the table sets were altered in order to ensure that all planetary phenomena needed for these products were accessible. And this actually touches on an issue that goes back to what I was referencing with respect to table set coherency. Because what we find is that the authors of these canons are not particularly attentive to any set coherent work that one might call the Alphonsine tables. And there's a fair bit of debate about what we mean when we talk about the Alphonsine tables, especially the so-called Parisian Alphonsine tables, or the PAT, which are these first extant set that emerge in the 1320s in the University of Paris. And yeah, so there's a fair degree of dispute about how exactly we're going to come to define these texts. In the case of a recent book review that came out about one of the books that's been printed with the Alpha Project that just came out this last year, looking at the manuscript record in Alphonsine astronomy. Philippe Notaft had noticed that what he considers to be one of the most important historiographic questions coming out of study of the Alphonsine tables, and what he said is by far the most pressing issue, what he calls an elephant in the room, is the origin of the Parisian Alphonsine tables. And he goes on to say that that he concurs with certain positions about how to define the tables. He says a preliminary survey of the extant Latin manuscript copies suggests that the title Alphonsine was initially reserved for narrowly circumscribed sets of tables. they really only covered three major aspects of planetary tables. Chronological tables, or tables of time, that would allow for you to set in a sexagesimal notation the time for which you want to know the position of a planet. The mean motion tables, that would give you the mean motions for all of the planets that you would want to find those true positions. And then the so-called equation tables, that would give you the values for the anomalies for each of the planetary models to correct the mean motions to find the true positions. And so from Notov's perspective, and indeed there's a lot of evidence to suggest this, in the earliest form in the 1320s, these were what one might consider to be the Alphonsine tables when talking about it. But by the time you get to the 15th century, in the Italian context that I'm looking at, there's a lot less concern about whether or not you define Alphonsine tables in that way. And in fact, there's a real desire to add to these tables, specifically to account for these issues that I think have to do with the professional development within the universities. Here, I just want to share a couple examples of that from the text that I look at. Here's coming from the Introduction to Prosdocimo de Beldamondi's 1424 canons on the Alphonsine tables. He gives in his introduction a fairly sensitive awareness of the fact that there are these different works, I suppose you could call them, and they could be defined according to their origins, whether they be the Alphonsine tables or other sets. But he also, in talking about them, willingly transgresses any sort of boundary of maintaining the integrity of those table sets, because he wants not to necessarily maintain a set that he thinks is original to one area or local provenance. Instead, what he wants to do is be able to marshal whatever tables are necessary to do certain things, to use them in certain ways that he thinks are absolutely necessary. So in his quote in the introduction, he says, there are many and varied possible tables that have been made and ordered to the celestial motions. Some have been perfected, like the Toledan tables, which on account of the duration of time have been set aside for being deficient of truth. So he recognizes that this earlier table set, that the so-called Toledan tables that were made available in the Western European context in the 12th century, are more all-encompassing, but have been set aside, at least in certain contexts, because they've been outmoded. And then he talks about other texts that are, other tables that might be as all-encompassing as the Toledan tables. He doesn't mention them by name, but he says that they are too lengthy, too intricate. And so then he turns to the Alphonsine tables thereafter. He says, in the case of the Alphonsine tables, they are so curtailed that everything in the figure required of them for making judgment is not included. That is to say, because they are constrained, and he recognizes the constraints, I suppose they're the same constraints that Notov defines as the chronological tables, the mean motions, and the equation tables. They're so curtailed that they can't perform the work that Prosdocimo wants them to create the figure. The figure he's referring to would be the typical nativity. This doesn't come from the Milan manuscript, this image here on the right. Rather, it comes from a 15th century French manuscript associated with Conrad Heingarter. Nevertheless, it's showing you, also a physician, by the way, and a physician astronomer. It's showing you the figure that Prosdocimo has in mind, and so he wants to augment those tables and include additional material that will allow for you to perform all the calculations that would be needed to create this figure. In Prosdocimo's text and in some of the other canons that I've looked at, the term that is given, and sometimes a body of knowledge that is given apart from the mean motion tables and the equation tables of planets that one needs to perform to create the figure, are called the passions. Sometimes they're called the passions of the planets, or the accidents. And in the case of Nicholas of Aquaeductus canons, an earlier form that actually were produced not in Italy, but in the 14th century that I've looked at, these passions are divided from the rest of the canon text and are given their own place and are defined in the way that I am quoting here from both witnesses to Nicholas of Aquaeductus' text. And it says, the passions or properties of the motions or positions of celestial bodies are their latitudes, their oppositions, their aspects, their eclipses, stations, retrogradations, ascensions, and descents or dissensions, their risings before or after the setting of the sun, their occultation in the sun's rays, and their velocities. Or he actually uses the word boot, which comes from the Arabic, but it's sort of like a relative velocity between two planets. And so all of these characteristics, all of these aspects or accidents, as they're called, of planetary motion are deemed necessary for considerations that have to do with the figure and interpretations of the figure. And so they also have to be included. I want to say a quick note, actually, before I move on here. Nicholas of Aqueduct's canons are themselves actually augmentations of older, more established canon texts that were written in the 1320s by John of Saxony and John of Lignere in 1322, 1327, respectively. And so Aqueductu, even though he is augmenting them, he is adding to them, he is relying upon these older texts that were devoted, especially John of Saxony is devoted specifically to probably this more constrained set of Alphonsine tables. And now if I can turn to the manuscript that I want to, or the work that I want to spend the rest of the time talking about, which is Lorenzo de Lorenzi's canons, the same thing is true of his work. Sometimes so he's also relying on John of Saxony and John of Lignere in important ways, but sometimes entire chapters are appended to the older canon text that he's relying on. Sometimes significant revisions occur within the existing chapters in order to provide new or explicit calculation programs that didn't exist in the earlier forms. And in both cases, what you see is that he's adding these calculation scenarios in a way that's obvious, or that's made obvious to the reader. You see in these two witnesses to Lorenzo de Lorenzi's text on the left and the right of the slide image, you see that there are these tables that are included at the base or in the margins of the text to give calculations that are going to help in some ways. Sometimes it's a check on the canons that as they provide instructions for finding a value, sometimes they are a check to go back and test to make sure that you've done the calculation correctly. That's the one I'm going to be focusing on now. Sometimes they are ways of doing shortcuts to a table to help skip steps that you would otherwise have to calculate again and again in following the canon to the letter. So in the service of saving labor, sometimes these calculation programs do that too. But I'm going to be focusing on this idea of checking your work, so to speak, in these scenarios. Also, Lorenzo de Lorenzi's work of the canons I've been looking at is the only one that I've studied that then explicitly has chapters devoted to using these calculations to make products useful for medical and judicial astrology. So what we see here are the last 7 canons of his work, in which he explicitly, in all 7 of them, the titles make it apparent for most of them, but he explicitly expects the calculations that you've been doing earlier in the chapters to then be used to apply to making something that's going to be useful for either medical astrology, judicial astrology, or some other artifact that falls outside of the scope of just finding planetary positions. The first 2 canons are still working on finding planetary positions in some way, whether a planet is stationary or direct, that is, whether it's in retrograde or not. The other one is finding the relationship of the sun and the moon at quadrature. But then after those 2, you see even in the titles that they're specifically talking about the objects of production that will be used after the fact. So making a judgment of a year, there's an entire chapter devoted to that. There's either a chapter, depending on which witness you look at, either an entire chapter or a sub-chapter of making a judgment of the year is a description of calculating what's called the orbis magnus. And if anyone here is familiar with this procedure or knows more about the history of this particular procedure, I'd be really interested to know, because it was unfamiliar to me before I worked through this text. But it looks like it's a sort of directing a significant planet from a time of great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter but over the duration of many years. After instructions for those two astrological procedures, there's another canon devoted specifically to medical astrology, where you're going to find the time of conception for a native based upon their nativity. And then there's one that's to find the degree of the ascendant. The fact that it's placed here alongside these others texts makes it clear, or it seems to indicate that it's being used specifically to find the ascendant for making a nativity or making a figure. And then the final chapter is on the composition of an almanac and how to use some of these checks and some of these shortcuts that are computational programs you've seen earlier in the text, how to use those to aid in the labor saving of finding your planetary positions in your almanac. All right. So what I want to do here for the next 10 minutes, maybe Samuel, you can also keep me honest when it comes to time, because it would be nice to maybe have at least 15 minutes or so, 15 or 20 minutes to talk. And I want to make sure I don't go over. But what I want to do now is to talk about one of these computational programs. It comes from the 16th canon of Lorenzo de Lorenzi's text. And it's at first drawn almost verbatim, although there are some alterations, from John of Saxony's same chapter, the same chapter that you would find in John of Saxony's more commonly used canons, which is to find the true position of the superior planets. There are no diagrams in the text, but I'm just using an adapted form of a diagram that comes from J.D. North's appendix to his work on Richard of Wallingford, just to kind of acclimate us to the steps that would be needed in the canon. What you ultimately have to do is first find the mean motion of the planet and the mean motion of the sun, and then using some intermediate angular values that will serve as the arguments for the tables that you're entering into, you will then go into the equation tables for your respective planet, and you'll find the anomalies, the two anomalies for your planet to correct for the mean motion to find the true motion. And so I have here kind of indicated on the diagram the mean motion of the planet at micron here, the true motion of the planet at lambda. Your goal is to, depending upon the values, either add or subtract a difference between the micron and the lambda position, which will eventually be called the second equation of argument. But it's one of these corrections that you go into the tables to find. You'll also have to find another correction, which is the second anomaly you have to take into account, which is a shift not in position based upon the epicycle, but rather a shift based upon the eccentric deferent that your planet is traveling about. And that's called the equation of center, and it's represented by this micron CM angle. So you have to correct for both of those angles, and then once you have, using the instructions in the canon, you can have your true position. This all follows more or less the same way that John of Saxony's procedure works. But then at the end of it, you have another procedure. This is what I'm calling one of these little computational programs that goes alongside the canon that tells you how to check your work. And what it does is it asks you to take that final value that you use. I'm going to actually flip back here just for a second. This final value that you use, the equation of argument, and you're going to add it to two of the angles that had been found in the midst of your procedure, the center and the argument, after they've been equated. In a certain way, you're going to have two parallel computations that are going to go next to one another. And once you've gone through all the computations, you should come up with the same value. And if you come up with the same value, according to the text, that means that you've calculated correctly, and you can say that it's been checked. It's a verification. He also calls it, at least in the chapter on the almanac, he calls it a proof too. So it's a verification and it's also a proof. What he means by that, maybe we could talk a little bit about. But what you have to do here, just to think about it, you have to take this angle from the planetary apogee to the point of uniform motion of the center of the epicycle to the center of the epicycle. Say again?
The equant you were looking
Yeah,
for.
the equant point, this equant point E. And this will be your mean center. Once it's corrected using the equation of center, it then becomes the equated center. So that's one, this is the one value that's of interest for one of these parallel computations. And the other value of interest is once you've gone from the mean argument, which is the angle from the mean aux of the epicycle to the center of the epicycle to the planet, once that's been corrected also with the equation of center, you have the equated argument, which is from micron CP. And that's the second angle of interest. So you know, the author of the canon wants you to think about both of those angles in relationship to this equation of argument. And here's what he says. He says, if you want to see whether you operated correctly for all of the planets, as well as for the moon, if the equation examined for the second time, that's this equation of argument, is to be added or subtracted from the mean motion, then in one place you add or subtract it from the equated center, and then that whole combination that you just did, you subtract that from the mean sun. And then he says, right in another place, to add or subtract it from the equated argument, and then to finally, in that second place, finally add the true aux. So you have this kind of series of two computations, and if you've operated correctly, the same value results in both sides. And then he says, and what results will seem amazing. Now, I included that what results will seem amazing because I want to think about, is this just a black box for these people? Is this, you know, is this just amazing because it works out and that's like a miracle? Or is it that there's something else going on and there's a relationship between these computational programs and a thought about the theoretical aspects of what's going on in the canons? And that's where I kind of want to get a little speculative, to think that maybe there is some thought about trying to make sense of what this means. There's just a small subtle point as to why I think that might be the case. But here, for our purposes, there are no, when I say there are computational programs, I don't mean that in the margin they're actually working out the values starting from a set date and then doing the work here. They're rather in the margins, they're telling you how to do these things. So what I've done is I just took an arbitrary date, December 1st, 1384, and I calculated the values I didn't do all the calculations in the slides here, but I kind of calculated it out to find the true position of Saturn. And then I also found the argument that you have to use, that argument you have to add or subtract to the mean motion to get the true position. And then with my calculations, I did the two programs that they tell you to do. I combined the equated center with the equation of argument, and then I subtracted both from the mean sun. And then in doing that, you get this value for this particular day, 1 sine 2 degrees 20 minutes. And then I subtracted, so when I added these two together and subtracted them from the sun, now I subtract this from the equated argument. So I subtract the equation of argument from the equated argument, and then I add the apogee, and I get a very similar value, very close, 1 sine 2 degrees 21 minutes. So I think I mostly did it right. And here's just kind of what you're trying to do. I'm using the notation of JD North just to kind of match what this check is. But if we go back to the model, we can kind of see why this works. And the reason why it works is because you can sort of recapitulate the computation that you were doing with angles on the deferent. You can kind of recapitulate that and put them onto the epicycle, and you can see that you're getting similar values, or the same value. What you're doing here, if I may, what you're doing here with the first computation is you're finding the value of the mean sun, which is the arc from Aries to the planetary apogee, to the mean sun, that arc and that angle, and you're subtracting the equated center and the equation of argument, which is this angle from omega to t to micron, and then the angle from micron to t to lambda, you're subtracting that. And what remains is the angle from Aries to t to omega, and the angle from lambda to t to the mean sun combined. Because we know from the model that the direction, and I didn't say this, but I should have, that the direction from the center of the epicycle to the planet is always parallel to the direction from T, the Earth, to the mean sun. Those are always in a parallel relationship. You can then place onto the epicycle here, you can see that you can superimpose the parallel lines of the line of Apsides, the line from the center of the Earth to Aries, and the line of the center of the Earth to the true position of the planet onto the epicycle now. And you can see that the argument, which is micron CP, with the equation of argument micron C lambda removed, and then that value will be this lambda CP, which is the same as the lambda T and the mean sun on the deferent. And then if you add the angle for the planetary apogee, which is this omega, then you get the same value. So you can see that what you're doing with those two computations in this check to see whether you did the calculation or not, is coherent with the planetary models here. But what's called a miracle isn't described that way in the canon. But one thing I do want to say is that if you go back to the original canon of John of Saxony, on which this one is based, you can see that the author, Lorenzo de Lorenzi, actually removed a passage from the original text, and then you could sort of think of it as in its place has put this check. So you get this check between the two, the relationship between the argument on the one hand and the apogee on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the mean sun and the equated center. That relationship, especially the relationship between the argument and the mean sun, has been placed as an arithmetic expression there in terms of a computational program. But in the original, what you get is actually a reference to the Theoria Planetarum, a reference to a theoretical text in which the author, John of Saxony in this case, explains why it is that you can perform certain procedures that sort of blend the relationship between the mean sun and the argument. So why is it that you can do these sorts of things? Instead of presenting it as a way of checking your work, as you do in the Lorenzo de Lorenzi text, in this text, you actually get an appeal to the model and an appeal to the relationship between these angles. He says the reason why the mean motion of each of the three superior planets is subtracted from the mean motion of the sun to get the mean argument is because each of the three superior planets is at the mean aux of its epicycle when it is in mean conjunction with the sun, and each of them passes through its epicycle in the same time that the sun returns to its conjunction. So because the motion of the planet on its epicycle from the mean aux and then back again is in the same time and at the same in the same position too as the motion of the sun at its aux and through its deferent back to its aux in conjunction with the planet. Because those are in the same, you can treat them as the same value. He says that is why the planet's distance from the mean aux of its epicycle is always the same as the mean motion of the sun's distance from the planet's mean motion. And then he goes on to say the distance of the mean motion of the sun from the mean motion of each of the planets is gotten by the subtraction of the mean motion of the planet from the mean motion of the sun. Having gotten this value, one has the distance of the body of the planet from the mean aux of its epicycle, since these are equal to one another, as has just been stated. So here, there is actually an argument based upon the theoretical foundations of the model and a justification for why some of these procedures work in the chapter, this has been removed, and in its place you have a check that's given, this arithmetic check that's given in the Lorenzo de Lorenzi's, and it's presented as a mirum, as a miracle or a wonder. And this is where I'm getting speculative, but I wonder to what extent the person who's serving as the editor or the redactor of the text, which is presumably Lorenzo de Lorenzi, to what extent does he realize that what he's doing with this arithmetic procedure is tied to the theoretical foundations that are made explicit by the text by John of Saxony's. There are a number of these kinds of computational programs that I'm interested in just kind of looking at systematically through the canons, and I'm working through them right now. I'm done with teaching, so I get to go back and I get to work through these. One of them is on the superior planets. The rest of them are more related to what you would call like the passions, these kind of like accidents, these planetary accidents that are useful to developing figures and other issues with respect to astrological practice. There's some of these programs in the chapter on mean syzygies, on true syzygies, on making radices for the meridian of the city. So when you're shifting your radices from one city to another, finding the degree of the ascendant, finding the time of new moon. And as I had already said, there's some links between the composing of the almanac and the checks that we find in the superior planet. Okay, so I think I'm going to kind of wrap this up now, but as a way of concluding, I do want to say a couple words about Lorenzo de Lorenzi's texts, the ones that we have, and how they're organized. And I'll just conclude real briefly with that. And I think this is another indicator of why it is that these particular canons are kind of special, especially special for those who want to use them for practice in astrology and medical astrology and judicial astrology in particular. One is that even though we have two witnesses, they are very, very similar. I'm calling them twin manuscripts, but I don't know if there might be a better word for that. They take the marginal notes, they take the base notes, and they recapitulate them identically. They have all the same content in both of the manuscripts, albeit the order is a little bit different, which has led to some confusion in some of the catalogs we still have handed down to us. So in the Oxford manuscript, which is the one on the left, the presentation is to have first the canons to the tables, followed by the Parisian Alphonsine tables, I'm calling them, and then followed by the augmented tables that include syzygies, parallax tables, eclipse tables, latitude tables, and oblique and right ascension tables. In the Florence manuscript, the order is shifted with the Parisian Alphonsine tables first, and then the augmented tables. And then the last 7 canons that are the ones that specifically are devoted to these astrological products are taken and put at the beginning of the work. And then after them, you get the canons that are devoted to finding planetary positions or times of significant planetary events. And this has led in the canons or the catalogs that we have available to us, this has led to some confusion where people think that there's actually 2 works that are found in the Florence text, but those 2 works are actually the same as the single work that you find in the Oxford one. So I think I'll close there just with that, because I don't think we have a lot of time here, but there are a number of questions about like who this author is and whether they're actually Lorenzo de Lorenzi. The Oxford manuscript is an autograph manuscript that that is written by the author of the work. It says explicitly in the explicit. So if I can find somebody who can help me like compare the autograph of this particular author with the humanist that he's been associated with, someone who's expert in that kind of work, then we would be able to tell if in fact it is the same person. But yeah, I guess I'll close there. Thanks so much for your attention, and thank you guys for listening.
Thank you so much, Nick. So that's great. I mean, I feel that you actually cut some of your presentation, but I think it's a good move. So we have some time to discuss, and I'm certain on there are a few points that people might have comments on, and I have also a couple of questions. So we're not very formal here. Anybody who would like to ask a question, just you can raise your hand or enter the discussion. You're very welcome. Thank you so much, Nick, for this fascinating talk of a topic that is less known. You are the world specialist on canons. I expected actually kind of an introduction, that you're giving us an introduction. What are canons and what role do they play? And you have done so actually by showing these concrete examples of how the composition of canons is not kind of a mindless copying of something that exists, but it's creative. It shifts to new focuses, to focus, and you talked about the probable professional interests that are kind of that come up in these selections. So I see a first hand raised here. Luis Pickers, please go ahead.
Well, I'm not definitely a specialist in Alfonsine astronomy, but so I have a very basic question. It is the following: these manuscripts you show us, they seem to be essentially astrologically oriented, or oriented to this kind of applications. And my question is, originally, when Alfonsine astronomy arose in medieval Spain, originally, what was the main motivation? It was a mix of astrological and calendrical, only calendrical, or only astrological. What was in fact the reasons to apply this effort in studying astronomy and this technical astronomy?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I was thinking about that too. Specifically, I wasn't thinking about it so much with respect to Spain, although the same question arises there, but thinking about the University of Paris, because so many of the texts that I'm looking at are find as their touchstone both the tables as they were compiled at the University of Paris, but also the canons as they were, some of these early canons as they were written at the University of Paris. And the questions that are being asked there aren't necessarily divorced from the questions that are being asked in Northern Italy. So there almost certainly will be questions that have astrological import to them. And John of Saxony writes a commentary on Alcabisi, on the introduction to the art of astrology. He's interested in those questions. But two things. One is that the calendar and time do seem to be things that are of great interest in the 1320s and the 1330s amongst this first generation of Parisian Alphonsine astronomers. There are people here who could comment more on that than I could. But it does seem like there are some questions that are of great import about, like, just hammering down the length of the solar year, for instance. There's also a certain amount of desire to just find out how to find planetary longitudes, master that body of material that has to do with finding the true position of all the planets, and to find eclipses in a way that is going to be satisfactory to people. So it's not so much that the kind of research questions. I think that the canonists who I'm looking at differ markedly from that. It's that they're expanding on some of those questions and saying, okay, so we've mastered what are the Alfonsine tables when it comes to finding true positions of eclipses, when it comes to finding true position of the planets. But what about now asking questions that are sort of maybe implicit in some of this earlier work, but now we want to centralize it and put it at the center of attention. That's kind of that's where I'm sort of getting a little bit speculative about it, by thinking about ways in which maybe there's kind of the way in which questions that have to do with these so-called passions or accidents might then reflexively force people who are more theoretically minded to think about them and to try and answer questions that then return people back to the models and return people back to the mathematical questions, even though they're being driven by issues that lie outside of quantitative astronomy.
May I just a little thing hopping on Luis's questions and your answer and looking at this slide, the fact that these 7 last canons are taken as a part and inserted before the other canons. Is this a kind of an indicator for you that they're considered an expansion or something like? I mean, the way you talk about it is really okay. They see some of it as traditional. This is already we mastered this. Everybody knows this, and now here, what is a plus that I can add and that would explain that there's this separation.
There's some recognition of what serves as the nucleus of the project, and then what is, I guess, the penumbra around it. One other thing I wanted to say is there's that's connected to both of these questions is the fact that John of Saxony, one of these early canons that was written in the 1320s in order to address the Parisian Alphonsine tables and how to use them, was much more focused on this what you might consider this coherent delimited canon set of tables of time, mean motions, and equation tables. And the other really widely circulated canon text, which is written by John of Saxony's teacher, John of Linéaire, was more expansive and dealt with a number of questions within the canons that move beyond the Parisian Alphonsine tables set. And so what I think is interesting is it's not to say, and this is again, it's not to say that what's happening in the Italian context is wholly new and wasn't being worked out in periods before, because it was. But what's interesting is where you find the variation, where you find differences, and you see original canons being written and worked out, are typically in those places that fall outside of that nucleus of the Parisian Alphonsine tables. And so this kind of gets to the idea that you were saying, Samuel, about parts of the canon, that a set that seem to be modular and be taken out and moved into different places, or in the case of all of these canonists, the places where they move away from John of Saxony and they write their own things. It's typically in questions about the eclipses, about parallax, syzygies, latitudes, etc.
Yes, Josefina, please.
Thank you, Nick, for your very clear presentation. It will look difficult, but you've made it very clear. I have just one comment and 2 questions for you. The comment is concerning Luis' question about the uses of the tables in Spain in the 13th century. And it is clear that in this century and in the context of Iberia, of Spain, of medieval Spain, there were astronomical uses, there were medical uses, and there were astrological uses. But in between, we should think, and there was an important discussion going on in Spain, and especially in southern France, about the use of talismans. Talismans magic because they need the tables to make, talismans for the right moment, in the right moment for the specific purposes. This is just a comment concerning the 13th century and, the Picatrix and all this wonderful literature related to this use of astrology in magic. My first question has to do with, Nick, you have mentioned that these tables were used in astrology, in medical astrology specifically, and I would like to know if there is evidence in which specific ways they might have been used. This is one question. And the other, I am very curious about because I have studied a lot of medieval astrology, this special chapter dealing with the Orbis Magnus. The expression is completely new for me, but maybe you can explain a little more about it because for instance, in Hebrew treatises, I would expect something about profectiones, which is the usual, and just after explaining the revolution of the year, explain this specific subchapter of the revolution. Thank you.
Don't be shy, but we have here one of the good specialists in astrology in our circle, so we can ask Luis Ribeiro afterwards about the
Excellent.
Orbis Magnus.
I'll
I'll let you answer the first question.
I'll answer briefly then, and maybe we can hear.
Yes, I know Luis is
First
here.
of all, thanks for the comment, especially with respect to the 13th century context. I'm less well versed actually in the. I know that the body of knowledge that constitutes what King Alfonso patronized was much more than just the Alphonsine tables themselves, and I think it would be worthwhile for me to at least look at seeing the full corpus and texts like the Picatrix and aspects of talismanic practice that might also require quantitative work. The reason I use the word medical astrology is mostly because I was looking at the fact that I'm thinking these sources were probably coming out of the university context where at least for two of the four authors, they were serving as within the medical faculty. There's one case in which there's a specific interest in medicine itself and the health of the body, and that's or at least the origins of the body, and that's calculating the nativity, the birth, the conception of an individual native. So being able to calculate the horoscope or the figure, and then retrodict when that person was conceived. And so to me, that one seems to be explicitly medical. The others seem to be more judicial. And so I think the reason I was kind of pairing those two terms together was because they were probably coming out of the needs and expectations of the medical faculty, but some of them were more general judgments like the Judicium Ani, and then others have a more specific medical interest, like finding out the conception of an individual. And then in terms of the Orbis Magnus, I don't have. I'll have to turn that over to Luis. My own understanding of that is that, and I need to return to that canon to read it more carefully, is that you find the time of a great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, and then you use profections effectively to track out the course of many years over the course, I think 360 years or something. And this seems to come from an astrological text that's referenced in my canons as Omar. And so I'll just leave it at that, because maybe Luis can give some more details of where it comes from and what exactly Orbis Magnus means.
Before going to Luis, just I realized that maybe this Orbis Magnus is just the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, possibly, and all the minor, the medium and the minor conjunction, I don't know, but I suppose this must be.
It very well might be. I left it untranslated because I didn't really know. I didn't really know what words to use at the moment for the Great Orb. But yeah, I don't know, Luis, if there's
okay.
more
Thank you for your talk. I found it very, very interesting. Well, what I can say, well, before we go to the focus on nativities can be, of course, in the context of natal astrology and medical astrology, but the conception and the calculation of the nativity can be simply done as a means of rectifying someone's birth. So I agree with you. If it's in a universitary context, medical astrology would be a main application, but it can also be simply working with nativities, you know, as you would for a patron or a client. You can have that aspect. It's so common, so they have to calculate it anyway. Another one that you haven't mentioned, and it is connected with the judgment of the year, is meteorology, astrometeorology. And that's also a big part of where these calculations of the year are going to go to, you know, crops, weather, etc. So that, I think, would be a central point for them of interest. As to the Orbis, I'm not familiar with the term. It's the first time I'm hearing it, so it's not a term I'm used to. But you have Omar, Abu Mashar, and Masala. I think Masala. I'm not certain about Masala. In the revolutions of the years of the world, in their various treatises, but especially Abu Mashar, who has the great on the conjunctions, they attempt to create, as you would do for a nativity, a way to direct or perfect the conjunction, to try to time events, you know, being signified by the conjunction. So I suppose it is one of those techniques. There are several, with several durations in time, but I suppose it's one of them. I'm not. It's not something I have, you know, right at the top of my head, but I'm sure it will be something. If you want to look at Abu Mashar would be the on the great conjunctions would be I think the main source for that.
Okay. Thank you much.
So, Nick, about the, I'm only speaking because I don't see anybody else asking questions, but your short intermezzo on the, you know, what you call the calculation programs that seem to be kind of practical means to check whether you did your computation right. It's actually a very nice find from my perspective, because it has this very practical, I mean, it's nothing to do with astrology, of course. It's really just a practical means for someone who needs to deal with numbers, doing multiple steps and with many chances to get something wrong. And I'm amazed that you managed to find the same result within 1 minute. Perhaps you tried several times, or you're just simply you're simply a gifted computer. But I mean, that's the idea of using this what John of Saxony gives as a theoretical rule, to use this as a practical tool to check whether something went wrong before it's too late, because then, you know, once you go on and do all the other computations, it's better you have a means to check it. The specific term of what was it? Videbitur mirum.
Yeah.
I have a vague memory that we have actually come across such an expression. We, with the three of us, Eleonora, you and me, when we looked, I'm not sure, one of the sources of Arabes Maxime. That was also very strange, and there was no program computation, but it was something like the text said the same as John of Saxony, that the argument of the superior planets is actually equal to the mean sun. And isn't this kind of a fantastic thing of God's work? something, and we kind of found this strange. Well, this is Ptolemy who did this. It's not God, but but in a way, if you think this is a description of creation, so God is behind this, and Ptolemy merely discovered it. So this mirum, I would like to try to find this other text again. I think it was the differences or something like that.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about too, and I remember this conversation actually, and I don't remember exactly what the source was, but that's what made me go back to the John of Saxony, because I wasn't, my original inclination was by calling it a miracle like that, that's a sort of black boxing of the material and not asking questions. But I remembered that there was a theoretical text that used the same language, and in the context of that work, there was an attempt at explaining from the perspective of the model why it is it worked. So calling something a wonder or a miracle or something like that doesn't mean that the person's not going to investigate what it is that is causing it. And actually, I think Campanus of Navarra might have a reference that's not unlike the one that we were talking about too, when it was I think it had to do with the fact that the syzygies in the lunar model are always, they always occur when the moon is at apogee. And I think that was called a wonder or something like that. And again, it's just as you say, it's not necessarily, it's a product of the model and how it was constructed by Ptolemy, but nevertheless, that's not how it's being envisioned by the people who are working with the model. They think these patterns are really significant. And it also doesn't mean that they're not going to try and explain it and explain the efficient causes or, explain how it works, just because they're saying it.
I mean, remember that I see that Josefina, I'll let you speak in a second, but just to say, there is something mysterious about the fact that the mean sun somehow shows up in one of the planets, the superior planets. I mean, what does the sun has to do with these planets up there? That is a miracle in a way, and Copernicus somehow solved it. But this is just a joke.
No, but I mean, people are seeing the patterns. They're wondering about it.
Josefina.
Yes. I'm going to continue with this expression because not in the same context, but in Hebrew texts, very frequently, I am thinking about Abraham Ibn Ezra, very frequently when he's explaining very technical things in which there is much calculation going on. He frequently completes or finishes the sentence saying, there is a soto here, there is a mystery, there is a secret here. This is very frequent especially in Abraham Ibn Ezra. Yeah, I don't know if maybe there is some link with some Semitic connection, some text
really
translation, I don't know.
Do you happen to have specific works by Abraham Ibn Ezra where
I can send you I can send you a couple of examples. Well, I think the expression is everywhere, but in the astrological works, if you check Shlomo Sela, you can find it. But not only, also in the biblical exegesis, in his biblical commentaries, when he's explaining astrological keys for specific passages, he's also using this expression. There is a sodot here, there is a big sodot, there is a huge secret here. Sometimes it's also in some treatise of the astral, in his treatise of the astral, I think he also uses the expression, but sometimes it's just, there is a lot of technical stuff here. This is just the meaning in some specific text, but in others, there is something else. Maybe it's the translation should be no secret, or is secret, but in, the key of this is, this technique, this rule, this technique. No, it's more like mystery in certain places. I will send you a couple of examples.
Yeah, please do. I'm really interested in Abraham ibn Ezra because at least some of his work where he writes expositions on canons for astronomical tables get translated into Latin. So it'd be interesting to see if some of these phrases make their way into Latin too.
Well, thank you. If there is no more questions, I suggest Richard wants to say something, so please. And then I think we should, because we usually try to keep the seminar within 1 hour, or
Yeah, sorry, we've gone.
no, it's okay, no problem. But more or less 1 hour, so I think we should. But Richard wants to say something, I believe. So please.
Okay, well, I wanted to introduce or to go back to the question of table set coherency. This is maybe opening a bigger topic if we're trying to close. So maybe you don't want to say very much, Nick. But anyway, I think that's a very interesting point that you talked about, how that as you go on in time, given the astrological needs, people would put together different sets of tables to do what they needed to do their astrological products, whether, whatever it is, as you were saying. I think that's very nicely said and obviously true. And you've also talked about Italy, as your focus on these canons is the Italian context. And to put those two together, I was wondering if you saw any evidence in the Laurentius canon of using tables that had been made, not the PAT in Paris, but Italian tables, like the Bianchini tables that were done in the 1440s, or the Proximo tables that were done in the 1420s. In other words, these were tables that had Italian origins, and they structured the mean motions differently than the PAT. So do you see, in terms of this question of how the table set is arranged, that Laurentius is describing in his canons, is he clearly describing sexagesimal mean motions that would mean he's talking about the PAT, the Parisian Alfonsine tables, or is he more general so that you could actually use Bianchini's tables with his canons?
That's a really good question. My sense was, I need to now go and look at the language really carefully, but there are tables that are appended to these two manuscripts, and they use the Parisian Alphonsine tables, but they also have additions. They have additions to those, but the additions are I don't think I think
they're for like eclipses and things.
They're in the Albatani tradition. I think they're the ones that go back to the Toledan tables effectively. There are also ones that I wouldn't know how to answer that question for, because I don't know what traditions to link them to, but there are like station tables, if that makes sense. They have a first station, a second station, and they're being used for retrogradation and direct motion. And I don't know what tradition I would want to link that one to, for instance. And it's probably
the Toledan tables in Pedersen, but you could check and see. But that's you're putting your finger on a very interesting problem here, is that some people focus so much on table sets and think that everything is in an identified table set. And as you know, one of the things we've been pushing at Alpha is to say we need to get away from this set idea and move to toolboxes, which have all kinds of things in. And they didn't care about boundaries. And by the time we get to the 15th century, we need to not care about boundaries so much, and we don't have table sets anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, I need to do some closer look at that, and also, now that the text has been transcribed, to do close readings of the mean motion ones, because it is interesting. Even if the tables are set next to the canons, that doesn't mean that the author of the canon wasn't thinking in terms of different modalities, so that they could write it in such a way that it could be linked to multiple tables, just as a way of thinking. It's possible that the language is ambiguous. I also, it's one other thing, just in response to what you said, Rich, going back to that quote from Philippe Notaft, I thought it was so, I'd never really thought about it until seeing it framed the way he did, but talking about Poole's modern edition from the 1980s of the Editio Princeps, and then thinking about the Editio Princeps and how in some ways you could think about that in terms of the amount of time that had gone on between the 1320s, when someone like John of Saxony was writing his canons, and then what was happening in Venice in the 1480s, when the Editio Princeps is being printed for the first time. And just like the editions, a number of editions, some editions that might even be linked back to John of Saxony, like the Eclipse canons. But anyway, I digress there.
Well, and I can digress even more. Philip's elephant in the room is a very interesting phrase. And I think that we need to think about that he's maybe thinking about elephants from the 1980s. And in the 2020s, we have quite different elephants in the room.
Yeah, we have different elephants.
And one needs to read that review with a lot of things in your mind.
Yeah, exactly.
that is not being referred to explicitly.
Yeah.
And,
really good.
and in fact, in the way you commented on this review, Nick, I noted that you skipped the idea of the origin of the table, and you spoke about the boundaries of the table, which is not the question Philip is looking at. And I think it's a more interesting question. But yes, that was just a remark on this. I have much to say, but we can talk later. Maybe I'm going right to you.
That'd be wonderful. Yeah.
This is wonderful. I mean, it's a pity that we have to stop here, but that's also the things work, and the aim of the talk is also to bring all of us together, and you can go on exchange by email and other means. So thank you very much, Nick, again for your seminar, for your talk, and thank you everybody for having joined.
Thank you all for inviting me. It was a pleasure.